The breakfast tray sat untouched on the nightstand, the scrambled eggs going cold, and the orange juice forming a thin skin of sugar at the rim of the glass. It was the third morning in a row that 7-year-old Lucas Hargrove had not eaten a single bite, and the private nurse that Daniel Hargrove had flown in from Boston at considerable expense stood at the foot of the boy's bed with her clipboard clutched against her chest, looking at the back of a child's head and running out of clinical language to describe what she was witnessing. Lucas was not unconscious, and he was not in pain, at least not the kind that showed up on any of the monitors lining his bedroom wall with their soft, persistent beeping. He was simply absent. Seated at the window, with his knees drawn up to his chest, and his pale forehead resting against the cool glass, he stared out at the gray November garden below, as if he were waiting for something that everyone else had long since stopped believing would come. Daniel Hargrove stood in the doorway of his son's room and watched all of this with a face that had learned, over the past 2 years, to absorb devastation without expression. He was 42 years old and looked, in moments like these, considerably older. His dark hair carried threads of silver at the temples that had not been there before Elena died, and his eyes held the particular flatness of a man who has cried privately for so long that the act itself had become a kind of internal hemorrhage, silent and continuous and invisible to anyone who did not know where to look. He looked at the tray of cold eggs and then at his son's unmoving shoulders, and he felt the familiar helplessness close over him like floodwater. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. He called for Dr. Reyes from the hallway, and the specialist appeared within minutes, because in the Hargrove estate, specialists always appeared within minutes. That was one of the very few advantages of a fortune that Daniel had not yet figured out how to spend on the thing that actually mattered. Dr. Reyes adjusted her glasses and consulted her notes and spoke in the careful, measured cadence of someone trained to deliver uncertainty with the packaging of expertise. She told Daniel that Lucas's vitals were stable, or that his autoimmune markers were not elevated beyond the previous week's baseline, and that what they were seeing was consistent with a continuation of the dissociative withdrawal she had documented since the previous Thursday. Since the morning after Clara Mendes had walked out of this house, carrying her canvas bag and her ruined dignity, and not a single word of apology from anyone who owed her one. Daniel did not make this connection. Not yet. The Hargrove estate sat on 11 acres of manicured Connecticut landscape, the kind of property that appeared in architectural magazines under headings like restrained magnificence and the geometry of old money. Then the main house was a 3-story Georgian revival, with ivory columns and a slate roof, and windows tall enough to fill entire rooms with the particular quality of light that only expensive glass can render. Elena had loved those windows. She had always said that the light in Connecticut in October was the most honest light she had ever seen, because it did not flatter anything. It simply showed things as they were. Elena Santos Hargrove had been many things before she became a wife and a mother and a woman whose name was now spoken only in past tense in this house. She had been a pediatric oncologist, trained in Sao Paulo and then at Johns Hopkins, a researcher of quiet renown, whose name appeared in medical journals under studies on childhood immunotherapy protocols that few people outside her field would ever read. But that had nonetheless changed the architecture of treatment for a specific subset of pediatric autoimmune cancers in ways that still rippled forward into hospitals and clinics she would never visit. She had given up her active practice when Lucas was born, not because Daniel had asked her to, but because she had looked at her own son's face and felt the gravitational pull of that particular love, and understood that she could not do both things with the wholeness they each deserved. She had kept her research, published under the name E. Santos Hargrove, but her patients had become her family, and the clinic had become a memory kept in a locked drawer of her mahogany desk that no one had opened since the accident. Lucas had been in the car. He had been strapped into his booster seat in the back, and he had survived the impact that had taken his mother at the intersection of Route 15 and Millbrook Avenue on a February evening when the roads were dry, and the fault, according to the police report, belonged entirely to a driver who had run a red light. Lucas had walked away from that accident with 2 fractured ribs and a deep cut above his left eyebrow that had required 6 stitches and that had healed into a thin, barely visible line that Daniel sometimes found himself staring at in the mornings as if it were a map of somewhere he could not locate. What had not healed, what no amount of money or specialists or carefully worded therapeutic interventions had been able to touch, was the silence. Lucas had not spoken since the night of the accident. He communicated in small, precise gestures, a nod, a pointed finger, but the occasional drawing left on a surface for someone to find. His autoimmune condition, which had been mild and manageable before the accident, had flared in the aftermath of the trauma in ways that his doctors attributed to the intersection of grief and a child's immune system that did not know how to distinguish between the external threat it was built to fight and the internal wound it had no language for. He had not smiled in 22 months. Patricia Vance had managed the Hargrove household for 11 years, predating Elena and outlasting her, a fact that she carried with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who understood that permanence is its own form of power. She was 53 years old, immaculately presented in the manner of someone for whom personal grooming is a professional statement, and she ran the estate's domestic operations with an efficiency that Daniel had come to depend upon in the way that grieving people depend upon anything that removes one more decision from an already overwhelmed mind. She hired and fired the cleaning staff, managed the household accounts, coordinated with the medical personnel, and controlled access to the family's private wings with a soft authority that rarely needed to raise its voice. Daniel trusted her the way he trusted the alarm system and the central heating, completely, and without examination. It was Patricia who had hired Clara Mendes 4 months ago, when the woman who had cleaned Lucas's wing for the previous year left for a position closer to her own family in New Jersey. She had interviewed Clara herself and selected her because Clara's references were impeccable, because her English was clear and precise, and because she asked no questions about the family's personal history during the interview, which Patricia interpreted as professionalism, and which was, in fact, simply the habit of a woman who had learned not to take up more space in a room than was offered to her. Clara Mendes was 34 years old, and she had been in Connecticut for 3 years, which meant she had been away from Brazil for 3 years, which meant that for 3 years she had navigated the specific loneliness of a person who carries an entire country of feeling inside a body that is perpetually surrounded by a different language, a different winter, a different quality of silence. She had grown up in Recife, the eldest of 4 children, in a household where money was something that existed in theory and prayer, and where her mother had worked as a home caregiver for elderly patients in the wealthier neighborhoods, carrying her dignity through other people's kitchens, the way Clara now carried her own through the Hargrove estate. Clara had worked her way through a nursing degree over 6 years of night classes and weekend shifts at a local pharmacy, graduating at 26 with a specialization in pediatric care and a quiet, bone-deep certainty that children were her purpose. She had married Roberto Mendes at 28, a structural engineer with a wide laugh and a habit of leaving his shoes exactly where they would be most inconvenient. And she had loved him with the uncomplicated totality of a woman who had never expected life to be particularly gentle, and was therefore deeply grateful for every moment of softness it offered. Their son, Matteo, had been born 2 years into their marriage, and he had been, from his first breath, the most specific and extraordinary thing that had ever happened to Clara. He was now 11 years old, living with his grandmother in Recife, while Clara worked and saved and sent money home each month in envelopes that always contained a note in her careful handwriting, a few sentences about Connecticut, about the autumn colors, about how she was keeping well. And at the bottom of every note, in her careful Portuguese, the words, "I love you to the moon and back. Today will be a good day." Roberto had died of a brain aneurysm when Matteo was 4 on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, while reviewing blueprints at his office desk. He had not suffered. The doctors had been very clear about that, though as if clarity about the absence of suffering were a form of consolation, which it was not. Clara had spent the 6 months following his death learning what her own limits were. Not the philosophical limits that people discuss in comfortable chairs, but the physical, financial, material limits. Of a woman alone with a 4-year-old and a nursing salary that paid precisely enough to survive, and not 1 centavo more. She had managed. She had always managed. It was both her gift and her cross. Matteo had been diagnosed with pediatric acute lymphoblastic leukemia at the age of 6. Clara had recognized the signs herself, the bruising, the fatigue, from the low-grade fever that came and went like an uncertain guest, and she had sat in the hematologist's office and listened to the diagnosis with the preternatural calm of a pediatric nurse who had delivered this exact kind of news to families dozens of times, and now understood, viscerally and finally, what those parents had felt when the words reached them. The treatment had worked. It had worked because of a specific immunotherapy protocol, a targeted approach for autoimmune-linked pediatric lymphoblastic cases that had been developed by a researcher whose published name Clara had seen in the citation list her son's oncologist referenced during treatment. She had not paused long enough on that name to remember it. She had been too busy being Matteo's mother, for measuring days in milligrams and milliliters and the specific shade of color in her son's face when he woke each morning. When the scans came back clean, and Matteo ran across the hospital courtyard with his grandmother chasing after him, Clara had sat on a plastic bench and pressed her hands against her face and breathed in the knowledge that her son was going to live. Then she had stood up, straightened her shoulders, and begun planning the next thing that needed to be done. That was Clara. That was always Clara. The job at the Hargrove estate was not glamorous, but it was consistent, and consistency was a currency that Clara valued above almost all others. She arrived at 6:45 each morning by bus, let herself in through the service entrance with the code Patricia had given her, and began her rounds with the systematic thoroughness of a woman whose professional standards had not diminished simply because she was now pushing a mop instead of taking vital signs. She cleaned Lucas's wing last, always, because she had noticed on her third day that the morning was the hardest stretch of hours for the boy, when the house grew loud with the arrival of medical staff and the clatter of breakfast preparations, and she wanted to disturb him as little as possible during that vulnerable early window. She had noticed Lucas the way she noticed all children who were suffering, not with pity, which is an emotion that moves away from its object, but with attention, which moves toward it. She had watched him from the hallway during her first week, seen the way the private nurse spoke over him rather than to him, and seen the way the specialists entered his room as though it were a laboratory rather than a child's bedroom. And she had felt the familiar, quiet anger of a pediatric professional who knows exactly what a sick child needs and is not in a position to prescribe it. She did not presume. She did not intrude. She simply cleaned his room with the same care she applied everywhere else and left small things in her wake. The crackers from his lunch tray rearranged into the shape of a star, because she had noticed, tucked under his pillow, a dog-eared library book about constellations. A single smooth river stone placed on his windowsill that she had found in the garden, not because she expected him to acknowledge it, but because she thought a beautiful thing in his line of sight might, without his even knowing it, make the hour a small degree more bearable. The first time Lucas reacted to her presence, it was a Tuesday in October. Clara was wiping down the bookshelf that lined the wall near the window, working her way through the dust settled in the spines of books that no one was reading, when she became aware of a shift in the room. She glanced over and found Lucas turned slightly away from the window, his eyes on her hands, not on her face, not with any expression that could be called connection, but watching the motion of her cloth against the books with the focused, exhausted attention of a child who has nothing left to be curious about except the smallest and most immediate things. Clara continued cleaning. She did not smile at him, or speak, or do anything that would signal she had noticed his noticing. She simply kept working with the deliberate, unhurried rhythm of a woman who had learned that trust, especially in children who have been broken by the world, is built in the space between pressures. 2 weeks after that, she brought him star-shaped crackers again and placed them on the nightstand, without a word. When she came back an hour later to collect the tray, 3 of them were gone. She began to hum while she cleaned his room, not loudly, not performatively, but in the low, absent way of a woman doing an ordinary task. She hummed a song her mother had sung to her when she was small, a slow, gentle Portuguese melody about the tide going out and the tide coming back, about things that leave and always return. She did not know if Lucas could hear it through his particular absence, but she hummed it anyway, the way she had hummed it beside Mateo's hospital bed on the worst nights, because sometimes a song is less about being heard and more about refusing to let the silence win entirely. By November, something had begun to change in the room when Clara worked, a quality in the air, or the angle of Lucas's shoulders. He was no longer pressed entirely against the window, as if trying to pass through the glass. He sat sideways sometimes, his legs loose, one small foot hanging off the edge of the cushion. He was still absent from the world in all the ways that mattered to the doctors and their charts. But in the room, in the space between his small body and Clara's unhurried presence, there was something that had not been there before, something fragile and unmeasured and entirely without a clinical name. Patricia Vance noticed. Patricia noticed everything that occurred within the walls of the Hargrove estate, which was precisely why she was so effective at her position and why she was now standing in the doorway of the service pantry, looking at the cleaning roster with a thin crease between her brows that she would not have described as concern, but that was, in its way, exactly that. Clara was spending longer in Lucas's wing than her schedule required. The floors in that section did not need additional minutes of attention. The books on that shelf did not require the kind of care Clara was giving them 3 times a week. Patricia understood, with the instinct of a woman who had protected her position for 11 years, that the slow, quiet accumulation of trust is more threatening than any bold assertion of it. A specialist could be replaced with a phone call. A woman who had found a way inside a damaged child's world was considerably more difficult to dislodge. She said nothing for 3 weeks. She was patient. She was always patient. She simply began keeping her own record of the hours, the small departures from protocol, the way Daniel's expression changed, or rather, the way it stopped being quite so flat. On the evenings when Lucas's nurse mentioned, almost casually, that the boy had eaten more at lunch, Patricia waited for an opportunity. In 11 years, opportunities had always come. It came on a Wednesday morning in the 2nd week of November, when the Connecticut sky had turned the particular shade of gray that suggests not merely rain, but the complete suspension of anything bright. And the garden below Lucas's window looked like a photograph from which all the color had been slowly, deliberately drained. Clara arrived to find the breakfast tray untouched for the 2nd day running, and Lucas seated in his usual position at the window, his forehead against the glass, watching the nothing outside with the expression of a child who has learned that the world will not explain itself to him no matter how carefully he watches. She set down her cleaning caddy by the door and stood for a moment, looking at the back of his head and at the cold tray and at the gray garden beyond the glass. And she felt something that wasn't part of her job description and did not appear on any of Patricia Vance's rosters. She pulled the small ottoman from beside the reading chair and placed it near the window. Not too close, so not beside him, but within the periphery of his world, and she sat down on it and looked out at the same gray garden. She did not speak. She did not move toward him. She simply joined him in looking at the thing he was looking at. After a moment, she began to hum. It was the same melody, the tide going out, the tide coming back, but slower today, shaped by the quality of the light. As she hummed it, she thought about Matteo in his hospital bed, with the IV line taped to the back of his small hand. And she thought about the nights when the song was the only thing she had left to give him. Her voice did not waver. She did not cry. She sat on the ottoman and hummed her son's song into the gray morning air of a room that belonged to someone else's child. For since she gave it freely, the way she gave everything that actually mattered, without expectation and without reservation. Lucas moved. It was not dramatic. It was the smallest possible adjustment, just the turning of a head, degrees rather than a full turn, his cheek lifting from the glass so that his eyes, those pale, exhausted eyes that the medical reports described as showing diminished effect and limited environmental responsiveness, could look at her. He looked at Clara, not through her, not past her, but at her, the way a child looks at something that has unexpectedly become real in a world that has mostly stopped feeling that way. Clara felt the shift and kept humming. She did not look back at him directly. She kept her gaze on the garden and her voice on the song, and let him look at her for as long as he needed to, the way you let wild things approach on their own terms. After a long moment, she turned her head, slowly, without surprise, without the bright and terrible enthusiasm that adults so often deploy at the first sign of a child's engagement, and she looked at him with the same calm steadiness she had brought to 1,000 pediatric bedsides. She saw his eyes, and for the first time, he was looking back. She gave him the smallest possible smile. Not a performance, just the warm, quiet acknowledgement of one person seeing another. His expression did not change, but he did not look away. Daniel Hargrove was standing in the doorway. He had come to check on his son before a 7:30 conference call, and he had stopped in the hallway because something in the quality of the room's silence was different. For he had seen the cleaning woman sitting on the ottoman, and he had seen the back of Lucas's head. And then, with a jolt in his chest that he did not know what to call, he had seen his son turn and look. He stood in the doorway for the entirety of that exchange, not moving, not breathing in any meaningful way, watching a woman with a canvas apron and no particular credential hold his son's attention with a song and a quiet look. He stood there until Patricia appeared at his elbow, her voice low and efficient, telling him that his driver was ready and that Dr. Reyes had left updated notes on the tablet. He looked at Patricia, then back at the doorway. Then he nodded and walked away. There was a call to take. There were always calls to take, and he did not think about it again until the following Monday, which was the day Patricia brought the matter to his attention in the study after dinner. She placed the music box on his desk first. It was a small, ivory-paneled thing with a painted scene on the lid, a garden in spring, the pigment bright and delicate, and it had belonged to Elena, given to her by her mother on the occasion of her medical school graduation. Daniel had kept it on the shelf in the sitting room adjacent to his suite, among other objects that had been Elena's, and that he could not bring himself to either display prominently or put away. The music box was now in two pieces, the lid separated from the base at the hinge, the painted garden bisected by a clean break that suggested impact rather than age. Patricia told him, with the expression of a woman delivering news she had been reluctant to carry, that a member of the cleaning staff had knocked it from the shelf while dusting. She said she had spoken to the woman directly and had given her the opportunity to come forward, but that the woman had denied any knowledge of the incident. She said the closed-circuit camera in the corridor confirmed that only Clara had been in that section of the house during the relevant window of time. She placed a printed timestamp on the desk beside the broken music box and folded her hands and waited. Daniel looked at the music box for a long time, the painted garden with its bright bisected spring. He thought about Elena choosing it from the shelf every few months and winding the small key at the base to play the 12-note Sicilian melody it contained. He thought about finding 5-year-old Lucas on the floor of the sitting room one morning with the music box in his lap, listening to it cycle through its 12 notes again and again and again, with the focused absorption of a child who has found something that answers a question he didn't know he was asking. He told Patricia to handle it. Clara was called to Patricia's office the following morning. She was told that the household had decided to make a staffing change, that her contract would not be renewed, and that she would be compensated for the remainder of the month. Patricia used words like restructuring and fit in the same clean, professional tone she applied to everything, and Clara sat across the desk from her and understood exactly what was happening and precisely why. She asked quietly, so whether she might know the specific reason for her dismissal. Patricia told her it was a matter of accountability, that the relevant details had been reviewed at the appropriate level, and that the decision was final. Clara did not argue. She did not raise her voice or demand to speak with Mr. Hargrove, or enumerate the months of reliable, careful, excellent work she had given this household. She simply nodded and thanked Patricia for telling her directly, and stood up and retrieved her canvas bag from the staff room and put on her coat. The other members of the cleaning staff looked at her from across the room with the guilty, averted eyes of people who know something is wrong and have the self-preservation not to say so. Clara gave each of them a small nod and walked out through the service entrance into the cold November morning. She paused once before the door clicked shut behind her and looked up at the window of Lucas's wing on the second floor. The gray light made it difficult to see clearly, but she thought she could make out the shape of a small head against the glass. She pressed her open hand against the front of her coat, over her heart, and held it there for a moment. Then she turned and walked to the bus stop. Inside the room above, Lucas watched the woman in the canvas apron disappear around the curve of the driveway. His pale forehead pressed once more against the cold glass, his breath fogging the pane in small clouds that vanished before they could become anything. In his hand, loosely held against his knee, was a drawing he had made that morning in crayon. A woman with dark hair and a yellow apron, sitting on a small stool, and looking out at a gray garden. He had given her a smile. He had not given anyone else in any of his drawings a smile. He did not know how to explain this. He did not have the words for it yet. But he pressed his forehead to the glass and watched the place where she had been for a long time after she was gone. The days that followed Clara's departure had a specific texture that Daniel could not name, and therefore could not address. He had an entire vocabulary for grief. He had been living inside it for 2 years. But this was something different. This was the grief of a household that had briefly held something alive, and then, through an act of ordinary negligence, had let it go. He felt it first in the mornings, when he passed the door of Lucas's wing, and heard the particular quality of the silence from within. Before Clara, the silence had been the silence of absence, a flat, airless quiet that pressed against the walls like water behind a dam. Now it felt like the silence of something recently extinguished, the way a room feels in the moments after a candle goes out, when the warmth is still technically present, but already retreating. Lucas had stopped eating on the second morning. By the fourth day, Dr. Reyes was consulting with a nutritional specialist about the possibility of a feeding intervention, using words in her gentle, clinical voice that Daniel absorbed without fully processing, because the part of his mind that translated medical language into emotional reality had a way of shutting down in order to protect him from what the words actually meant. He authorized whatever was needed. He signed the forms that were placed in front of him. Then he asked the right questions and received the right answers, and stood in his son's doorway each morning and watched Lucas's narrow shoulders and felt, with increasing and terrible precision, that he was watching his son disappear. It was Lucas's day nurse, a soft-spoken woman named Helen, who had been with the household for 6 months and who communicated primarily through careful understatement, who brought the drawing to Daniel's attention. She knocked on the study door on a Thursday afternoon, holding a piece of paper with the particular reverence that people reserve for things that are fragile and important, and that they are not sure they have the right to touch. She told Daniel that she had found it on the windowsill of Lucas's room that morning, tucked beside the river stone that someone had placed there weeks ago and that no one had removed. She thought he should see it. Daniel took the paper from her. It was a crayon drawing, the medium of a 7-year-old, but executed with a precision and intentionality that stopped him. A woman with dark hair and a yellow apron sat on a small stool, angled toward a window, looking out at a garden rendered in careful shades of gray. Around her, Lucas had drawn something that looked like a glow, not a halo, nothing religious, just the simple visual grammar of a child communicating radiance through concentric curves of yellow crayon pressed hard into the paper. The woman in the drawing had a smile. It was a specific smile, neither broad nor performative, just the warm, quiet acknowledgement of one person seeing another. Old Lucas had drawn it with a precision that suggested he had observed it closely and committed it to memory. Daniel looked at the drawing for a long time. Then he asked Helen who the woman was. Helen was quiet for a moment. Then she said it was the cleaner, the one who had been let go. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Daniel set the drawing down on his desk and did not pick it up again immediately. He went to the window instead and stood looking out at the garden, the same gray November garden that his son looked at from above. And he tried to locate the specific memory he was reaching for. It surfaced slowly. The doorway, the morning light, the ottoman, the woman with her gaze on the garden and her voice low and unhurried in the room, his son's head turning. He had walked away from that doorway. He had walked toward a conference call and a driver waiting in the cold and the accumulated machinery of a professional life that did not pause for the things that mattered most. He had seen his son make contact with the world for the first time in 22 months, and he had nodded at his household manager and walked in the opposite direction. The recognition of this was not a sudden blow. It was the slow, cold arrival of something he had already known and had been managing not to face. He went to the kitchen. The cleaning staff worked a staggered schedule, and on Thursday afternoons, 2 of the women, Marta and Denise, were in the service wing preparing for the evening routine. Daniel did not often appear in the kitchen at this hour, or in this manner, without purpose or agenda, and they both straightened when they saw him and looked at each other in the way that people do when they are not sure what version of an authority figure is standing before them. He told them to please continue and that he only had a question. He asked them about Clara. Marta answered carefully, the way people answer when they are weighing honesty against self-preservation. She said that Clara was a very good worker, very thorough. She paused, and Daniel waited, and then Marta said that Clara was also very kind. With the boy. She said it quietly, as if the observation were a confidence rather than a fact. She said that Clara used to bring him crackers arranged in different shapes, and that she would stay a few extra minutes sometimes, just to make sure the room felt settled before she left. Marta said she didn't really understand why Clara had been let go, because none of them did, and her voice carried in it the carefully controlled inflection of someone who understood more than she was saying. Daniel thanked her. He went back to the study and sat behind his desk for several minutes. Then he picked up the phone and called the estate's security management firm. The footage from the corridor camera outside the sitting room was time-stamped and searchable. Daniel pulled it up on his desktop with the same systematic efficiency he applied to quarterly earnings reports, and he went back to the date Patricia had cited in her presentation of the incident. He watched the corridor from 7 in the morning until 6 in the evening. So he watched the light change in the hallway as the day moved. He watched Patricia pass through at 9:42, moving briskly toward the east wing. He watched the afternoon staff move through at various intervals. He watched Clara, clearly identifiable by her canvas apron and the particular way she carried her cleaning caddy, close to her body, angled away from the walls, working her way through the corridor at 2:17, heading toward Lucas's wing, which was in the opposite direction from the sitting room where Elena's music box had lived on its shelf. He checked the timestamp Patricia had given him. 2:19. Clara had not been within 30 feet of that shelf at 2:19. She had been walking away from it. He sat back in his chair and felt the cold clarity of understanding settle over him. He did not reach for anger immediately. He reached instead for the larger picture, the pattern beneath the individual incident, and he saw it now with the same uncomfortable lucidity with which he had once read a balance sheet that didn't add up. Patricia had been the only other person in the corridor that morning. Patricia had brought him the broken music box and the printed timestamp and the careful expression of reluctant loyalty. Patricia had been managing this household for 11 years, and in all that time, Daniel had never examined the managing itself, only the results it produced. He called Patricia into the study the following morning. He placed his laptop on the desk between them. The security footage cued and paused at 2:17, and he watched her face as he pressed play. She watched it. Her expression did not collapse immediately. She was too experienced for that. Instead, there was a period of perhaps 5 seconds during which her face ran through several calculations that Daniel could not follow, and then she straightened in her chair and shifted her approach with the practiced agility of a woman who had navigated difficult conversations for a long time. She said that the timestamp she had provided was based on information given to her by another staff member. She said there may have been a miscommunication. She said that regardless of the specifics of that particular incident, there had been a broader pattern of concern with Clara's behavior in the household that warranted attention. Daniel asked her to describe the pattern. Patricia paused, and in that pause, in the specific quality of the silence before she assembled her next sentence, Daniel heard everything he needed to hear. He heard the territory being protected. He heard the calculation of a woman who had grown so accustomed to being the most essential person in a room that she had lost the ability to distinguish between protecting the household and protecting her own position within it. She told him that Clara had been spending excessive time in Lucas's wing, that she had been acting outside the scope of her role, that it was not appropriate for a cleaning staff member to develop that kind of proximity to a vulnerable child without medical or professional oversight. She said she had been acting in the family's best interest. Daniel looked at her for a long moment. Then he told her, very quietly, that she had framed an innocent woman and dismissed her from the household on a fabricated charge, and that what she had done had cost his son the first meaningful human connection he had made in nearly 2 years. He told her that her employment was terminated, effective immediately, and that she was to gather her personal belongings and leave the property before the afternoon was out. He told her that his lawyers would be in contact regarding the final settlement of her contract, and that any attempt to dispute the circumstances of her departure would result in him providing the security footage to those lawyers in full. Patricia stood. She was still composed. She was always composed. But her composure now had the quality of something held together by will rather than by actual solidity. She told him at the door that she hoped he knew what he was doing, that a man in his position, raising a damaged child alone, needed people around him he could rely on, that not everyone who showed kindness had clean motives. She said it with the measured precision of a parting warning, and then she left, and the room was quiet in the way rooms are after something has finally been removed from them that should have been removed some time ago. That evening, Daniel went to Lucas's room. He did not bring a doctor or a new therapeutic agenda or the careful scaffolding of another structured intervention. He simply went in the way that a father goes to his child's room at the end of a long and difficult day, without purpose, without a plan, carrying only the weight of his own presence. He sat down in the chair beside the window, not across from Lucas, but beside him, angled toward the same gray garden his son had been watching for weeks. He did not speak. He did not reach for the boy, or prompt him, or provide the warm, professional encouragement that the specialists had outlined in their treatment notes. He simply sat, the way Clara had sat on the ottoman, the way people sit when they have finally understood that being present is not the same thing as doing something. The room was very still. After a long time, Daniel did not know how long, because he had stopped checking his watch. He heard a sound. It was not a sound he recognized at first, because it had been so long since he had heard it. It was thin and rough-edged, the voice of something that had been submerged and was only now finding enough air to surface. It was a single word, shaped with enormous effort, as if each letter had been carried up from a great depth. Lucas did not turn his head when he said it. He kept his eyes on the garden and his forehead close to the glass, and he said the word into the darkness outside the window as if he were addressing the garden itself, or the night, or someone he believed could still hear him. Clara. Daniel did not move for a moment. He sat very still and looked at the side of his son's face, the thin jaw, the shadows beneath his eyes, the barely visible line of the old scar above his brow, and he felt something shift in his chest with a force that was both devastating and, for the first time in 2 years, entirely uncomplicated. It was not the complex, managed grief he had learned to carry. It was something simpler and more urgent. It was the recognition of a mistake that could still be corrected, and the understanding that correcting it was the only thing he needed to do right now. He reached out and placed his hand over his son's small hand on the windowsill, covering it completely, the way you cover something you want to keep warm. And he told Lucas, in a voice that was lower and rougher than he intended, that he was going to find her. He said it once. Lucas did not look at him, but his fingers under Daniel's hand curled upward. Not quite a grip, but not nothing. The tide going out. The tide coming back. Daniel drove to Bridgeport himself the following morning. He did not send anyone ahead, did not delegate, did not call first. He got the address from the employment file his assistant pulled, and he sat in the back of the car watching Connecticut move past the window, the manicured Greenwich hedgerows giving way to the chain-link fences and weathered storefronts of Bridgeport. And he thought about the distance between these two worlds. Not in terms of mileage, which was 23 minutes by car, but in terms of the choices and accidents and structural indifferences that made 23 minutes feel, to most of the people living at either end of it, like an unbridgeable gap. He had been one of the people for whom the gap was invisible, because invisible is exactly what gaps are when you live on the comfortable side of them. The building was 3 stories. The brick faded to a pale rose by decades of weather. The entrance door propped open with a folded piece of cardboard. He found the apartment number and climbed 2 flights of stairs that smelled of cooking oil and cold air, and he knocked. There was a pause, the kind of pause that happens when someone on the other side is deciding something. And then the door opened. Clara Mendes looked at him the way she had looked at Patricia Vance the morning she was dismissed, without hostility and without warmth, with the steady, measured steadiness of a woman who has been through enough not to be surprised by anything anymore. She was wearing a dark sweater, and her hair was pulled back, and she looked tired in the specific way of people who manage their exhaustion so consistently that it becomes simply another feature of their face. Behind her, Daniel could see the apartment. Small, extremely clean, the furniture second-hand but arranged with care, a pot on the stove and a child's drawing taped to the refrigerator. He recognized the medium. Crayon, pressed hard, specific. He told her he knew about the music box. He told her it wasn't her. He said he was sorry, not with the practiced diplomacy of a man who apologizes as a corporate strategy, but with the blunt, unpolished sincerity of a person who has driven 23 minutes and climbed 2 flights of stairs specifically to say a thing he should have said before any of this happened. Clara listened. She did not say that she had told him so, because she was not that kind of person. She did not perform graciousness or relief. She simply absorbed what he had said and let a moment pass, and then she asked how Lucas was. The question undid something in Daniel that he had not known was holding. He had prepared, on the drive over, a sequence of things to say, an explanation, an offer, a logical case for why she should consider returning. He had the language of a man who solves problems with structure. But the first thing she asked, after he had driven 23 minutes and apologized for what his negligence had cost her, was how his son was. And he found that he did not have the language for what that did to him. He told her the truth. He told her that Lucas had not eaten properly in nearly 2 weeks, that he had not spoken since the accident, not once, not to anyone, until last night, and that the word he had spoken was her name. Clara closed her eyes. It was a brief closing, a second, perhaps 2, and then she opened them again and looked at him with an expression that was not triumph and not pity, but something that seemed to hold both the sorrow and the love of a person who understands, at a cellular level, what it means for a child to be lost inside himself, and what it means when he reaches out. She asked Daniel what he needed from her. He told her he needed her to come back. He told her she would have a different role, not cleaning staff, but something that didn't have a name yet. Something built around what she had already demonstrated she could do for his son. He said he would pay her fairly, that her position would be secure, and that no one would question her presence in Lucas's wing again. He said all of this in a straightforward, unvarnished way, because it was the only register he had left after a week that had stripped most of the others away. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she said that she appreciated what he was saying, and that she wanted to help Lucas. She said this without qualification, as a simple statement of truth, but that she needed him to understand something first. She asked if he had a moment to sit down. They sat at the small kitchen table. Two people from opposite sides of a 23-minute drive, with a pot on the stove between them and a child's drawing on the refrigerator, and the particular tension of a conversation that both people sense is about to become something larger than either of them expected. Clara told him about Matteo. She told him the way she told everything, without drama, and with the precise economy of a person who has had to make every word count, about Roberto's death, about the diagnosis, about the years of treatment that had taken everything she had financially and given her back the only thing that actually mattered. Daniel listened with his hands folded on the table, his face very still. Clara said that Matteo was in Recife now, with her mother, and that he was healthy. She said the word carefully, as if it were still new, still something she had to test each time she used it. She said that his treatment had worked because of a specific immunotherapy protocol, a targeted approach for his type of case that his oncologist had told her was considered a significant development in the field. She had not known much about the science of it. She had only known that it was working. Why, she said the protocol was published under a researcher's name that she had seen once and not fully registered, because at the time, her whole world had narrowed down to a single room in a hospital in Recife and the specific color of her son's face when she walked in each morning. Daniel was very still. He asked her quietly if she remembered the name. Clara shook her head slowly. She said she thought the first name started with an E. She said the surname had 2 parts, hyphenated. She said she thought it was Portuguese on one side. Daniel reached into his jacket pocket and took out his phone. He opened the browser with the particular deliberateness of someone who already knows what he is looking for. He pulled up a paper from the Journal of Pediatric Oncology and Immunotherapy, published 4 years ago. He turned the phone so the screen faced Clara and placed it on the table between them. The name at the top of the paper read, Santos Hargrove, M.D., Ph.D., Johns Hopkins Pediatric Research Division. Clara looked at the screen. The kitchen was very quiet. The pot on the stove made a small sound. Outside the window, a car passed on the street below, and then the street was quiet again. Clara looked at the name for a long time, and then she looked at the small photograph beside the author biography, the photograph that Elena's publisher had used for the past 6 years, a professional headshot that Elena had complained made her look too serious, that she would rather have been taken outside, that Daniel had promised to have retaken and had not managed to arrange before February and Route 15 and Millbrook Avenue. Clara looked at the photograph of Elena Santos Hargrove, and she looked at Daniel, and she looked back at the photograph. Something moved across her face that was not a single emotion, but the simultaneous arrival of many. Recognition, disbelief, the slow and enormous weight of understanding, and beneath all of it, in the deepest register, something that wasn't grief and not gratitude, but the particular feeling a person has when they understand that they are standing at the center of something so much larger than themselves that the edges of it cannot be seen from where they are standing. She asked, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, whether Elena Santos Hargrove was Daniel's wife. Daniel looked at her. He said yes. The room was very quiet. Clara pressed both hands flat against the table, a gesture of steadying, not of anchoring herself to something solid. And she looked at those hands for a moment, and Daniel watched her and did not speak, because he understood that she was in the middle of something that required no words from him and all the space in the room. Outside the small window of the Bridgeport apartment, the Connecticut evening was arriving in stages. the sky moving through the gradations between blue and dark, the streetlights beginning their slow assertion, the first stars appearing above the roofline. Clara looked at her hands on the table. She thought about Matteo running across the hospital courtyard, alive and whole and laughing, chased by his grandmother. She thought about the woman behind the protocol who had made that possible, a woman she had never met and whose face she was seeing now for the first time, and small and serious in a thumbnail photograph on a phone screen. And she understood something that had no clean language, but that settled into her chest with the weight and the warmth of an irrefutable truth. The circle of compassion does not always announce itself. Sometimes it is invisible until the very moment it closes. Sometimes the thing you gave in one direction returns to you from a direction you never thought to look. Daniel sat across from her at the small table and watched her face and said nothing. He was not yet the man who had the words for what he was seeing. But sitting in the quiet kitchen of a woman his wife had saved, without knowing it, watching that woman understand the shape of a connection that had been there all along, invisible, patient, traveling its long way toward the surface, he felt something begin to shift in him, not loudly, not dramatically. The way light changes in a room when a cloud moves, almost imperceptibly. And then you realize the room is different than it was a moment ago, and you cannot say exactly when the change occurred. He had come here to ask for something. He had not expected to receive something in return. He did not yet know what to call what was being given to him. But he recognized it. The way you recognize something you have been without for so long, that the recognition itself is a kind of grief and a kind of relief, arriving together, inseparable. He waited quietly for Clara to find her way back to the surface. Clara came back on a Monday morning. She did not use the service entrance. Daniel held the front door open himself. She went straight to Lucas's room and sat on the ottoman and looked out at the garden and began to hum, the tide going out, the tide coming back. Lucas turned from the window, and then, for the first time in 22 months, he smiled. It was small. It was the most important thing Daniel had ever seen. Elena had saved Matteo's life without knowing it. Clara had saved Lucas's without being asked. Some debts cannot be repaid, only carried forward, gently, into the next person who needs them. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.